Okay, so what we're talking about in this video is we're going to be going over chapter 11, which is sample surveys. And there's some kind of big ideas we have to know. And the first one is we have to know about the idea of a sample. And the idea of a sample is that you're examining part of a whole. And there are some definitions we have to know. Okay, so the population is the entire group you want to learn about. Okay. And then a sample, start it here, drag it over. A sample, it is a subset of the population that is examined. So we can't look at the whole population, we look at a subset, okay, to see if we can learn about the population. So we want to learn about the whole population, hard to do. So a lot of times we take a sample that should teach us about the population. Okay. All right, so bias. Bias, it's when sampling methods over or underestimate a characteristic of a population. There's a lot of different types of bias that we're going to have. The goal is to remove as much bias as you can. Okay. All right, so the next thing we have is we want things to be random. We want to have a randomized survey. And so randomizing things protects from any influences and reduces bias. So it's really important that we take samples from random, and there's a lot of different ways that we could take them from random. Okay, so population parameter. These are key numbers and model that we want to know about. Won't ever really know for sure, but I like to say P is for population and parameter. So think about P, population, parameter, okay? And then statistic is the summary found from data. Sometimes it's also known as the summary statistic. So these are the results we get from the sample. So we're looking for the average height of high school students, but we're not going to sample all high school students. So we take a sample, and that we find the average is 5'8", and that is our statistic. So the parameter was the height of the population, which we're not going to know, but then we find a sample statistic. Okay. All right, so here, statistics, whoa, that's a really thick marker. Let's try this one. That one's not as bad. Okay, so statistic comes from the sample. These are things we know. We can find this. Parameter comes from the population. This is what we want to know. We're not really ever going to know it. I mean, because it's very hard to survey everything and find everybody. Okay, so we know this, and we've used some of these. And so a statistic mean is Y bar. The parameter for the mean is called the mu. Standard deviation is S, but the parameter standard deviation is called sigma. Correlation is R, but the parameter correlation is rho. I'm not supposed to be a little bit more curved. Regression coefficient, that's your slope, that's B. And for the parameter, it's beta. And then proportion is P hat. And for parameter, it's also P. What you should recognize that these letters on the left, statistics, those are letters you recognize. That's English. But parameter, it's like we don't know it. These are our Greek letters that you're not familiar with. You don't know them. You might know them, but I like to kind of help you remember the difference between the two. Okay. So let's make sure we highlight some of this stuff. Okay, so now looking at some more. Our next thing is our sampling frame. And again, I'm trying to type it so it goes a little faster. But I have to start it over here. So our sampling frame, it is the list of individuals, including all combinations, you take a sample from. So if it asks you to find the sampling frame of flipping 2 coins, it would be, or flipping 3 coins, and it asks you to list the sampling frame, it would be something like tails, 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 heads, tails, heads, tails. So like you're writing them in order. That would be the sampling frame if it asks you to list it. Okay? Sampling variability. This is the natural tendency that samples differ. Doesn't look like I spelled tendency wrong. There we go. That's one nice thing about typing, that I can fix my spelling errors. Okay, so now we have to talk about the different types of bias. Now, some of these types of bias kind of are going to feel like they overlap. And sometimes you can have more than one bias, and you have to kind of pick the one that's the more important, or the one that's kind of standing out more. Okay. And so the first one is, it's called convenience bias, but it's also called a convenience sample. And this is when you take a sample that is easy and not random. For example, I want to survey, Ms. Razor wants to survey students about their experience during COVID and online learning. She decides to ask her first period class. That is a convenience because they're right there in front of me. They're super easy to do, but that is not random and it is biased. Okay. Voluntary response bias. This is when a large group is invited to participate. Those that want to do the survey. What's wrong with this is that, let's see if I can insert a shape. I'm going to draw an arrow. Oops, that's a highlighter. What's wrong with this is that a lot of times people that volunteer to do things, they do things if they have strong feelings one way or the other. Oh, come here, I'm having a hard time with this. So, this a lot of times comes from things sent in the mail. Maybe it's on websites. Problem is that people that have strongest feelings do the survey. Not so you don't get a lot of the middle of the road answers. You get a lot of the people that feel really strongly one way or the other. Okay, and so now undercoverage is when a portion of the population is left out of the sample. So there's a group that is undercovered. They don't get covered. Okay, this happens a lot in phone surveys. Let's see if I can make a bullet. because not everybody has phones. It's not as bad as it used to be. Can't spell surveys right now. If people are going house to house, maybe they're going certain times. So time of day you try and contact somebody, because if you're contacting people only during the times of 1 to 3, you're missing out on all the people that work. Okay, so that's under coverage. Okay, so response bias. I can't actually type here. That's nice. So non-response bias is when a large portion of those invited do not reply. So there's not a bunch of non-responses. Okay, and then the last type of bias we have is response bias. And response bias has a couple different ways. One thing is the wording of the question. Is it leading? Another one is who asked the question. And the last one is how is the question asked? So the wording of a question would be, version 1 says, are you in favor of raising the local sales tax 1% to help our homeless community? Version 2 says, are you willing to raise local taxes 1% to help our homeless community receive job training and mental health services? So the second one kind of gives you reasoning, and it's much more, yeah, that actually sounds like a good idea. I want to support that. Okay. The who asks a question. If somebody's doing a survey and they are asking you if you went to a party last night, if it's a coach asking you versus a student asking you, right, you're going to answer differently. Okay. And then the last one, how is the question asked? There are times that people a good example is I ask somebody, how are they feeling? And then I ask them, but I'm closer, so I'm in their personal space. So anything to make somebody feel uncomfortable, that can also be response bias. Okay, so there's lots of different types of bias, and they can sometimes have overlap. It's going to be important that you can explain when you have the different types of bias. Okay. All right, now we have different types of census. Okay, so I'm sorry, now we have different types of samples. So a census is when you try to sample everybody in the population. Okay, there are some cons for this. One is it's time consuming, takes a lot of time to try and reach out to everybody. It is very costly. It's hard to do. And you end up with a lot of data. And all that data can be very hard to look at. Okay, so a census sometimes is not a very good way to go. Not many people actually try and complete a census. An SRS, this is the most basic type of sample, a simple random sample, and you have to assign random numbers to each individual in the population and randomly select them. Okay, one thing that's important about an SRS is everybody and every combination has an equal chance of happening. Okay, and SRS is the most common. All right. A stratified sample is you split population into something called strata, and strata are homogeneous groups, which means they are like groups. So you can stratify by gender, by grade level, by job title. Those are all different types of strata. Okay. With the stratified sample, you take a SRS of each strata. So once you split them into the groups, then you take an SRS of each strata of each group. Stratified samples are really nice because they help you see the difference among groups. Okay. The next one is a cluster. For a cluster, what you do is you split population into clusters, which are heterogeneous groups. Oh, that's not right. Geneous groups. And those groups you think are a mix of people and represent population. So you think it's a good mix of everybody. Once you have your clusters, you randomly select a cluster, sometimes multiple clusters, and take census. So you contact everybody in that group. So stratify, you split into groups, and then you take some from each group. Cluster, you split into groups, but then you take one group and you ask everybody. So there's going to be groups or clusters that are left off. Okay, so for a systematic, you create some kind of system. So it could be something like every 12th person. Usually it's going to be somewhere between every 5 to 20 person. When you take a system, so you create the system you're going to follow. So when you take a systematic, you have to make sure you start at a random place. A systematic could be also that you're going to take every third person in a blue shirt. Things like that, those are systematic. Okay, multi-stage, it's a combination of two methods. Be careful, a cluster takes a census, that does not make it two methods. Okay, and then I gotta hurry up, class is starting. A judgment is when you pick based on opinion or judgment. You believe it represents the population. So there's a lot of different types. Sorry this video was long, but hopefully this helps you understand some of the information.